Good afternoon, and thank you for joining me today. Before we start, I'd like to briefly speak about a topic that's top of mind for many of us right now, the U.S. debt limit. Earlier this month, I told the U.S. Congress that our best estimate is that the United States government will be unable to continue to satisfy all of its obligations by early June, and potentially as early as June 1, if Congress does not address the debt limit before that time. That projection underscores the urgent need for Congress to act as soon as possible. In my assessment, and that of economists across the board, a default on U.S. obligations would produce an economic and financial catastrophe. Millions of Americans could lose their jobs, household incomes would be reduced, American businesses would see credit markets deteriorate, and millions of American families that receive government payments would likely be left without the resources that they were promised. This would make it dramatically harder for households to spend and businesses to invest. A default would threaten the gains that we've worked so hard to make over the past few years in our pandemic recovery, and it would spark a global downturn that would set us back much further. It would also risk undermining U.S. global economic leadership and raise questions about our ability to defend our national security interests. Short of a default, brinksmanship over the debt limit can also impose serious economic costs. We know this from recent history. As we learned in 2011, just the serious threat of default can lead to a downgrade of our credit rating and a weakening of consumer confidence. We could see a rise in interest rates drive up payments on mortgages, auto loans, and credit cards. We're already seeing spikes in interest rates for debt due around the date that the debt limit may bind. And there is no good reason to generate a crisis of our own making. The U.S. Congress has raised or suspended the debt limit almost 80 times since 1960. I urge it to act quickly to do so once again. Let me now turn to our work at the G7. I'd like to thank first Finance Minister Suzuki and his team for hosting the G7 Ministerial, and thank you to Japan for its leadership of our group this year. There are many issues that we will work on this week, but today I'd like to highlight three of my core priorities. The first is the global macroeconomy. We're taking a broad range of individual and joint actions to bring down inflation, sustain growth, and help mitigate the impact of external shocks, including to developing countries. The second is to redouble our commitment to support Ukraine as it defends itself against Russia. And the third is our longer-term work to bolster economic resiliency and security. As we advance these priorities, I look forward to working not only with my colleagues from the G7, but those from several non-G7 partners that are here this week, including developing countries and emerging markets. We all have shared goals. I look forward to productive discussions about how we can better deliver for all. First, even as we face downside risks, I believe that the global economy remains in a better place than many predicted 6 months ago. In most G7 countries, including the United States, annual headline inflation has fallen in recent months, and the growth outlook for the global economy is better than it was in the fall. In the United States, we've taken decisive action to tackle elevated inflation and strengthen confidence in the banking system, while also enacting a trifecta of historic legislation to raise our long-term growth potential. Other countries have taken actions to address their near-term challenges as well. We encourage our partners to make long-term investments in their productivity and in combating climate change. When we strengthen our own economies, we strengthen the global economy as well. But we need to do more. It's important that we take concerted actions to improve the economic outlook for the entire world, particularly in developing countries. That's why we'll coordinate on our efforts to push hard for timely and comprehensive debt treatments for countries in debt distress. And it's why we've worked hard to take joint actions to lower food and energy costs during a volatile period. Many of these actions have had the largest impact on the poorest countries. Of course, we remained attuned to economic headwinds and downside risks. The world was still recovering from the pandemic when Russia began its illegal full-scale war against Ukraine. These shocks continue to impose significant costs on the global economy. Further, markets are seeing the possibility of a U.S. debt limit breach as a growing downside risk. I will continue to work with my counterparts on ways to strengthen the global economy over the next few days and beyond. Second, I look forward to coordinating with other G7 members to support Ukraine and degrade Russia's ability to wage war. When the G7 finance ministers gathered together last spring, Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine was less than 3 months old. Now, the war is approaching its 450th day. Since day one, our countries have stood united to support the Ukrainian people as they have mounted a fierce resistance. The United States is proud to have provided significant economic, security, and humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. And we're just as proud to be part of a broad coalition that has stepped up to assist Ukraine in its moment of need. We're pleased that the IMF's program for Ukraine will provide critical financing for the country while putting it on a path of macroeconomic stabilization and future recovery. The program will bolster President Zelensky's commitment to accountability and good governance, and it will help Ukraine's economic officials provide a steady hand for its economy and reform agenda in the coming months and years. We're also continuing to lead a multilateral coalition of over 30 countries to impose heavy economic costs on Russia for its war. Over the past year, our campaign has systematically degraded Russia's military-industrial complex and helped reduce the revenues that Russia can use to fund its war. Because these sanctions are having an impact, Russia is trying to get around them. This year, a central piece of our strategy is to take further actions to disrupt Russia's attempts to evade our sanctions. Our three-pronged approach involves improving information sharing and coordination among allies and partners, putting pressure on companies and jurisdictions that we know are allowing or facilitating evasion, and identifying and shutting down specific channels used by Russia to equip and fund its military. We have taken a wave of actions in the past few months to crack down on evasion, and my team has traveled around the world to intensify this work. Our innovative policies to support Ukraine extend to our joint efforts to restrict Russian oil export revenues. Last May, the G7 finance ministers discussed the price cap policy for the first time. Our goals were twofold: to reduce revenues for the Kremlin while helping stabilize global energy markets. A few months into its implementation, we see clear signs that the price cap is working. The Russian government's oil revenues from January through March of this year were over 40% lower than a year prior. And importantly, global oil markets have remained relatively stable since the imposition of the crude oil cap last December. In short, the price cap has helped stabilize the global economy, just as it's hurt Russia's ability to wage its illegal war. Members of the price cap coalition are committed to prohibiting or phasing out imports of Russian oil, but we continue to urge developing countries to save on their oil costs by taking advantage of the price cap to negotiate steep bargains on Russian oil. As I've said before, we'll stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. Now, third, I will work with my counterparts on our longer-term initiative to build greater economic resilience and bolster economic security. Our goal is not only to enhance resilience for ourselves, it's also to build resilience for our allies and partners, including developing countries around the world. We're advancing important work to build reliable and secure critical supply chains. This is part of an effort I've called friendshoring. We also believe that our supply chain diversification efforts can open up more trade and investment opportunities for developing countries that have traditionally only had limited footprints in global supply chains. During the upcoming G7 meetings, I'm looking forward to discuss ways we can partner with developing countries to help them better integrate into global trade in a way that moves countries away from solely extractive industries into activities that provide greater support for the domestic economy and employment. This work will build on the investments already underway through the G7's Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. Our partnership is already helping bolster global supply chains by mobilizing private capital toward infrastructure projects in developing countries. We also look forward to building on our work with about a dozen countries through the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that was launched this time last year in Japan. The G7 will also advance our work to mitigate geostrategic risks in our economies. As I said in a speech last month, the United States has a broad suite of tools to mitigate risks to our national security, and we will take narrowly targeted actions when necessary. We're looking forward to working with the G7 to effectively counter economic coercion, which is a key feature of Japan's presidency. We also know that many of the threats to economic resilience are coming from the global challenges that we all face. Since last fall, the United States has worked with shareholders to evolve the multilateral development banks to better combat 21st century global challenges. Transboundary challenges like climate change, pandemics, and fragility and conflict are disproportionately impacting the most vulnerable among us. We are accelerating the momentum for our evolution initiative and aim to adopt a rolling set of World Bank reforms over the coming months. These G7 meetings present us with an opportunity to coordinate our collaboration with and support for lower income countries. Let me stop there, and with that, I'll be glad to take your questions.
All right, we'll go first to Andrea, Reuters.
Madam Secretary, thank you so much.
Speak into the mic.
Thank you so much, Madam Secretary. The U.S. debt ceiling debate that you addressed at the top of your remarks is kind of overshadowing a lot of these other multilateral efforts that you're trying to get done. The President yesterday said the U.S. could go into recession if this happens. You've talked about a global slowdown. Have you modeled exactly what kind of a downturn it could involve? And also yesterday, the President said he was considering invoking the 14th Amendment. Can you speak to that and what you think the effect of that would be, whether that would help?
Well, with respect to modeling of the potential costs of the debt ceiling breach, U.S. Treasury hasn't undertaken its own models, but the Council of Economic Advisors published something in which they provided estimates, and Moody's and others, Mark Zandi, testified and provided his estimates of what he thought the impact would be. I must admit there's a lot of uncertainty attached to this, but if you, for example, only take account of the fact that if we had to lower spending to match incoming tax revenue and could no longer issue debt, you would be looking at a very substantial cut in government spending, which on its own, forgetting about other impacts on financial markets, on financial institutions, on consumer confidence, and so forth, that in and of itself would be substantial. So all of these analyses shows that we would fall into, if this lasted for any meaningful period of time, a very substantial downturn.
All right, Chris Condon from Bloomberg.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Secretary Yellen. The Biden administration is preparing an executive order that would add new restrictions to outbound U.S. investments to China. Two questions related to that. First of all, there are some critics already emerging predicting that this executive order would be more of a symbolic action designed to make the Biden administration look tough on China without really making a meaningful, practical impact. So the first question is, how would you respond to such criticism? And second, in regard to these meetings here and this executive order, are you looking to your G7 counterparts for feedback or even endorsements of this planned executive order? Thank you.
So restrictions on outbound investment is something that could be the subject of an executive order, and it's something we've been discussing internally in the administration for some time. We're committed to discussing this with our partners. Obviously, it would be most effective if there's coordinated action by a group of like-minded countries and agreement that this is a useful approach. We haven't finalized the approach that we're likely to take in the United States, and we have been engaging in discussions with our G7 colleagues, and I would expect that that would continue with these meetings, at least in some informal way. Most of what we have discussed internally, although nothing has been finalized, I think you mentioned, would it be symbolic and not very meaningful? And I guess I don't see it that way. I believe it would be narrowly scoped and targeted at technologies where there are clear national security implications. I gave a speech on China a couple of weeks ago and discussed the concerns we have around national security and indicated that the United States has a very strong commitment to protect our national security. That occurs partly through reviewing inbound investment through our CFIUS process, through export controls, and some restrictions on outbound investment would be a complement to that. My own view is that this should be national security focused. It's not focused at undermining, say, China's economic competitiveness or ability to advance economically, but that it would have a national security focus. That's it. That's not symbolic, but we would like to work jointly with our partners and our continuing conversations on that.
Andy Dern from Wall Street Journal.
Hi, Secretary Yellen. I wanted to ask, you mentioned this idea of countering economic coercion, and I know you obviously are working on some of these efforts around supply chain resiliency, but I guess beyond that, what are some ways that economic coercion can be countered? I mean, what's kind of on the table there for the G7? And kind of related to that, China has recently been amping up pressure on Western companies there, searching offices and such things like that. I mean, is that an example of economic coercion, and is that something that could merit a response of some kind from the United States or the G7?
Well, I mean, there have been examples of China using economic coercion on countries that take actions that China's not happy with from a geopolitical perspective. Australia suffered that, Lithuania, there are other countries, and that's a matter that should be of concern to all of us. I'm certainly aware of the examinations that they've conducted of American firms recently, consultancies operating in China. I don't know if I would include that in the same bucket. And I don't have anything concrete to say by way of plans, but I would say that many G7 members share a common concern with this kind of activity and are looking to see what we could jointly do to try to counter this kind of behavior.
Katie Forster, AFP.
Thanks. Thanks, yeah. So just hours ago, former President Donald Trump urged Republicans to do a default if no Democrat spending cuts are made. What is your reaction to that, please? And also, are the G7 finance ministers discussing any concrete new actions regarding sanctions evasion, as you mentioned in your speech, please?
So I'm aware of former President Trump's comments about default. As I've emphasized and the President has emphasized, and actually all of the congressional leaders who met on Tuesday recognized a default is frankly unthinkable. America should never default. It would be tremendously economically and financially damaging. I think it would rank as a catastrophe, and the numbers we were discussing previously make that more concrete in terms of what the likely consequences are. So the notion that under any circumstances we should default and that that's a reasonable strategy. America simply, as a global leader and as the leader in having the reserve currency that's most used around the world and the broadest and deepest capital markets, the notion of defaulting on our debt is something that would so badly undermine the U.S. and global economy that I think it should be regarded by everyone as unthinkable. We may differ in terms of our views as to how to structure spending, what the appropriate level and composition of spending, taxation is. President Biden laid out his views on what's appropriate in his budget. He proposed plans that would involve $3 trillion in deficit reduction over the next decade while continuing to invest in the long-term growth and productivity of the U.S. economy and ask corporations and wealthy individuals to pay their fair share on the tax side. The Republicans have laid down very different ideas, ones that President Biden and I considered to involve draconian cuts that would harm our long-term economic well-being, repealing our clean energy, climate change programs, and cutting to the bone discretionary programs that put teachers in the school and fund law enforcement and veterans medical care and other priorities, but a process has been set up to negotiate fiscal policy, which is of course appropriate. Another meeting is scheduled for next Friday, and staff are working to see if they can resolve this. So I'm very hopeful that the differences can be bridged and the debt ceiling will be raised. I now realize, Andrea, I didn't answer your question about the 14th Amendment, since we're on this topic. The 14th Amendment, the idea there that was discussed is that possibly that amendment would justify just issuing debt sufficient to pay all the government's bills and ignore the debt ceiling. And what President Biden said in his remarks is it's really not, there would clearly be litigation around that. It's not a short-run solution. And what I would say, it's legally questionable whether or not that's a viable strategy. But look, as I've said previously, if the debt's, I'm often asked questions, if the debt ceiling is not raised, what would you do? Would you do this? Would you ignore the debt ceiling and pay all the bills? What exactly would you do? And I don't want to go there and discuss alternatives. There are choices to be made if we got into that situation. But as you think about each possible thing that we could do, the answer is there is no good alternative that will save us from catastrophe. And so I don't want to get into ranking which bad alternative is better than others. The only reasonable thing is to raise the debt ceiling and to avoid the dreadful consequences that will come if we have to make those choices.
Madam Secretary, can I ask a question from the Japanese reporter as well?
Okay. I'm sorry, I'm sticking to the same topic, but I'm wondering if you see any, in the long term, way to end this cycle of almost 80 rounds of brinksmanship that are leaving us in this position, sometimes more than once a year. Is there a way in the long term to find a better way to deal with this problem?
So my personal opinion on this, I'm not speaking for President Biden, but I've weighed in on this topic previously, and personally, I think we should find a different system for deciding on fiscal policy. Congress could repeal a debt ceiling or handle it differently. For a time, it was handled, and these are some proposals, that the president could unilaterally decide to raise the debt ceiling and inform Congress of it. Congress would have an opportunity, if they wish to, vote to override his decision. The president could veto that. It would take a supermajority of Congress to override the veto. That would be one kind of change. But look, when Congress votes on appropriations and they vote on taxes, and those decisions imply a path of deficits and a set of bills that are entailed by those choices. And to then impose a debt ceiling means it puts my Treasury in the position of having bills come due to pay for programs that have already been legislated and essentially services we've already contracted for, and then says, you can't pay for all of it. We're limiting you, so you can't pay all the government's bills. And I don't think that's any way to run the government. So there are a variety of alternatives, and my own preference would be not to go, and to go through this every couple of years is tremendously damaging.
Can I ask a question?
That's all the time we have. Thank you.
From one question from Japanese reporter.
you, guys.
As
Thank
you are
you.
in Japan, so can I? Just one question,
So
Yeah.
we've got to head to our next meeting. Thank you so much.
Madam Secretary. Are you here?
She has to have it in the next she'll be at like some of the photos and stuff. But I know she's doing another like. Yeah, and does she only work as you know, we were supposed to go. But if you know it's me, I can take my email. Let me make sure I have my card on my purse. If not, I will text my mom.
I actually completely forgot the second half of your question, but I am the sanctions spokesperson, so if you have any.
I'd be happy to walk you through a little bit about what we're doing.
今、財務省の会見が終わったところなんですけれども、財務長官がですね、アメリカの債務上限の話をかなりしていて、債務上限というのはアメリカのですね、借金をできる限度が決まっていて、それをアメリカは定期的に引き上げなきゃいけない。その再査定に応じなければ、その債務上限というのを引き上げないということを言ってるんですね。それに対して今、アメリカの中でかなり積極になっていてですね、でそういう中で、今回、イエレン財務長官が日本に来ているわけですね。ですので、ほとんど記者からの質問は、債務上限引き上げについてですね、イエレン長官が言っていた中で、印象的だったのは、これがですね、引き上げられないとカタストロフィー、惨事になってしまうと、そういったことは考えられないことであると。だからこそ、アメリカの議会がですね、なんとかその債務上限を引き上げるということを言っていて、それに関するオルタナティブ何か代替策っていうのは今考えるようがないということも言っていました。で、私も最後にかなり質問しようと思ったんですけれども、日本の記者の質問を当ててほしいと、私自身が財務長官は、小川政権時代かなり取材もしてですね、質問もしてですね、会見でも質問していたんです。ただ、 結局質も当たらずに終わってしまって、ちょっと残念でした。で、広報官はちょっと時間がなくて申し訳ないということをしていて、イエレン長官が私に最後は総理ということを去ってしました。ちょっと残念でしたけれども、またこのまま仕事を続けると思います。今日はありがとうございました。
Doing as much damage to Russian weapons as possible, like get things